The land once called Persia, now known as Iran, is introduced as if the earth itself were whispering an old secret. It sits between continents like a hinge on a door, opening toward Europe on one side and Asia on the other, a crossroads where caravans, ideas, and armies have passed for thousands of years. Even before Rome had a name, this place had a pulse, steady, stubborn, and hard to kill. Civilizations rose and fell around it. Empires burned hot and vanished. Yet this center of mountains and basins, plateaus and deserts, reappeared again and again, durable in a way that unsettles conquerors and fascinates historians. Tonight the story is told as a slow unveiling, not a sermon, not a lecture, but a quiet walk through deep time where the echoes of old footsteps never fully fade. The ground is old here, and so are the hands that learned to shape it. In the Zagros Mountains to the west, those folded ridges that cast long shadows across the valleys, small villages were already learning to coax life from the soil by 7,200 BC. Places like Chokha Golan and Chokha Bonut appear early, not as myths, but as archaeological facts. Charred seeds, stone tools, grinding stones with smooth hollows, the stubborn remains of hearths that warmed thin air. Wild barley, lentils, and other legumes were encouraged to grow with human patience, a pact written not with ink, but with seasons. In a jar about 7,000 years old, now in a university museum far from those mountains, someone left a trace of wine. That jar is more than an object. It's a message that people had already learned to turn harvests into memory, and memory into ritual. From the beginning, the people of these mountains lived in conversation, sometimes gentle, often violent, with the plains to the west. There, in what is now Iraq, rivers made cities possible, and irrigation made those cities powerful. Sumer reached eastward and helped spark Susa around the late 5th millennium BC, a city that would outlast dynasties and ideologies and hold the thread of continuity through 5.5 millennia, until horsemen from the far horizon finally tore it down. Susa became the capital of Elam, the first defined nation that can be recognized inside the boundaries of what later becomes Persia. But Elam was not an imitation of the plains. It was a confederation of mountain peoples, harder lives, fewer numbers, tougher habits. If the plains wrote in water, the mountains wrote in stone. They had a language that doesn't match their neighbors, an Elamite tongue we can only partially read, a script that resists easy translation. In their art, animals matter, dogs with keen posture, bulls whose weight is shaped in the line of the shoulder. Their gods appear in groves and on ridges, around fire and wind, in a world where nature is not background, but a presence, tolerant, composite, and open to absorbing the deities of anyone who traded or fought with them. Women, too, stand beside men in depictions, not behind them. Queens share the stage with kings. It is not a modern invention to say so. It is carved in the objects they left behind. That cultural rhythm, respect for women beyond what many neighbors allowed, will echo uneven but audible across later Iranian societies. The relationship with the plains was always a draw and a clash. Irrigation made cities like Ur and Akkad populous, and from numbers came armies. Elam lost early, recorded in the first known war narrative. Sumerian soldiers marching into the highlands and looting. Sargon of Akkad took Susa, but time does not belong to a single flag. By around 1100 BC, a king named Shutruk-Nahunta led Elamite armies back down into the plains, pressing Babylon, rolling cities like a wheel rolls pebbles. Even so, nothing lasted long. When a land holds value, enemies multiply. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would strike back. Borders would breathe in and out like lungs. Trade did not stop. Elam, because of where it sat, became a broker of the world's necessities. Tin from the east, stone and wood from the mountains, crafted goods moving along routes that would one day be called the Silk Road. The mountains did not grow silk. but they learned to count coins minted in distant places that coveted it. Then came newcomers with different horses and different habits. Steppe peoples moved in waves across Eurasia, and among them were the early Iranians. Aryans, in the ancient geographic sense, not the polluted modern misuse of the word. Medes, Persians, and Parthians drifted and settled, adopted land, mixed with those already there. The blend took centuries. It wasn't a collapse. It was a slow turning of the soil. Elamite remained the language of administration long after Iranian dynasts took the throne, a practical fact that says more about continuity than any myth. The day-to-day ledgers and contracts still ran in scripts scribes already knew, even as the elite names on the seals changed. The Medes began to build a state, at least according to later storytellers like Herodotus, the same Herodotus who turned the last stand of a few hundred Spartans into legend. Whether every name and date is perfect doesn't matter as much as the contour. Mountain tribes learned to federate, to answer a brutal empire to the west, the Assyrians, with a disciplined alliance of their own. Nineveh fell in 612 BC, a city so feared that its ruin became a world event. But it was not the Medes who would carry the idea to its furthest reach. That role would belong to the Persians under a ruler whose reputation crosses both time and borders, Cyrus the Great. Cyrus began as a vassal. He did not inherit a completed throne. He built one. Around 553 BC he rebelled, and rumor says a Median general named Harpagus crossed the line and joined him. No one living can certify the promises whispered that day, but the facts are plain. Within a span measured in years, not generations, Cyrus stepped into Babylon in 539 BC, and a world order shifted. The stories keep a simple rhythm when they speak of him. He unified the Iranian peoples into a machine that didn't just conquer, it administered. Satraps governed territories larger than many kingdoms, but they did not rule alone. The king's eyes and ears, inspectors faithful to the center, moved quietly along the roads and reported what was real, not what local officials claimed. 4 capitals spoke to regional pride, but Susa, the old Elamite heart, beat at the center of administration, the records kept where habit and bureaucracy were strongest. The roads themselves formed arteries. Way stations offered water, food, a bed, and fresh horses at regular intervals, a relay that turned distance into calculation rather than guesswork. Messengers could move from one end of the empire to the other, with a speed that felt like magic to those who only knew muddy paths and dangerous nights. The system was good enough to survive conquerors. Later empires would copy it more than they would replace it. This is one test of genius in statecraft, whether your enemies adopt your methods after they bury your banners. There is also a quieter story about how Cyrus treated the defeated. He spared temples, respected customs, and in Babylon he allowed a people in captivity, the Israelites, to go home. In their text he appears not as a villain, but as a chosen instrument, a foreign king praised like a liberator. It is unusual to be a conqueror and leave warmth behind, but the records repeat it. He didn't merely take land. He created conditions where different ways of life could continue so long as taxes were paid and rebellion stayed dormant. The immortals, the 10,000 elite, stood as both myth and mechanism, a core always full, always ready, the face of imperial resolve. His son took Egypt. The machine kept moving, slow and heavy but forward. Then Darius I took the throne and inherited a frontier that tilted toward the Aegean. He reached east into the Indus and west into trouble. The quarrel with the Greek cities, the first great invasion that weather turned and underestimation complicated. Marathon became a word people remember, less for what it meant to Persia than for what it meant to Greek self-belief. Anger and intent prepared a second strike, but Darius died before it launched. Xerxes led the follow-up, burned and evacuated Athens, watched his fleet die at Salamis, and retreated, an emperor whose campaigns became the spine of stories told by his enemies. Persia did not collapse. It remained enormous, rich, and frightening to most of the world. But it learned that the sea around Greece could be brutal, and that small cliffs and narrow straits could tear strategies in half. Inside the empire, the water problem was never ignored. Arid lands require invention if people are to thrive without exhausting the soil. In places like Shushtar, canals bent the course of rivers to power mills and irrigate orchards. Underground channels, qanats, ran like hidden veins beneath the earth, angled so carefully that water could creep for miles without eroding the shaft that carried it. You can still see the footprints of their making in the dotted line of vertical access holes across the desert, as if the land was stitched by a giant's awl. Ice domes, yakchals, stored winter's cold in great earthen cones, so that summer fruit and grain could keep longer than the heat permitted. The point wasn't luxury. It was survival with dignity. A culture reveals itself in its games and instruments as well as its laws. Backgammon travels well and survives conquests because its logic is both simple and deep. Claims are made about the tar, the ancestor of the guitar, sounding first in Persian hands. Chess is argued over by India and Iran like a treasured heirloom with two branches of the family. These details matter less for their origin myths than for the feel of daily life they imply. Evenings with rules and laughter, hands moving pieces on boards, wagers of pride more than coin. The status of women, compared to many neighbors, remained notably broad in certain periods. Owning land and business, traveling, even riding and practicing archery among the elite, these were not fantasies. They appear in records because someone had to write transactions down, and the names on the contracts belong to women as well as men. No one should mistake this for modern equality. Thrones stayed male. But the social space carved out for women shows that the culture did not always mirror the most restrictive practices nearby. Religion, too, found its own shape. Zoroastrianism stepped forward out of older beliefs, announcing a cosmos where truth and falsehood were not merely poetic forces, but the deepest measure of human choice. A good god and an evil spirit struggled. Not in a violent brawl, but in a tension that passed through every decision. Fire mattered because it was pure, water because it carried the world's memory. Angels and demons, judgment and an afterlife, a moral order named in simple words. These elements later echo in texts written far from Persia. Even the image of wise men traveling to greet a newborn king carries the faint scent of magi, priests who tended flame and calendar together. Yet the kings did not force this faith on every subject. Tolerance remained policy more often than not, because an empire made of many peoples requires more glue than fear. And then the young man from Macedon crossed the water. Alexander was trained by Aristotle, carried by the momentum of his father's conquests, and sharpened by the hard edges of his own ambition. He moved with an army not large by Persian standards, but fast and convinced. At Issus in 333 BC, the Persian king Darius III faced him with superior numbers in the wrong geography, wedged between mountains and sea where cavalry could not breathe. When the Persian line buckled under a direct assault, Darius fled first. That moment, perhaps more than any other, cracked the empire's aura. Faith is half of any army's strength. A king's back turned too soon is a blade in the ribs of morale. Tyre resisted and paid in blood. Gaza did the same and suffered equally. Egypt, exhausted and calculating, opened its gates. On the Nile Delta, a city called Alexandria took root and would learn to think for centuries. The library that would grow there, of papyrus, of ideas, tried to hold the world in shelves. But the center of the story was still in the Iranian heart, where Persepolis burned. Whether it was a drunken revenge for the burning of Greek sanctuaries, or an accident that swelled beyond control, The palace went up in flames. Alexander regretted it, they say, when the cool of morning returned. But the char is part of the record now, black on stone. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, with open field and room to maneuver, Darius still fled. The pattern hardened into fate. Alexander chased legitimacy as he chased the man, marrying into the old royal line, presiding over mass weddings at Susa to bind officers to noble families, mixing commands so that Macedonian and Persian soldiers learned each other's rhythms. It made his veterans uneasy. They had followed him through wounds and plague and wanted no sermons on Oriental ways. In a drunken argument, he killed a friend who had once lived his life. Greatness isolates. Even genius cannot be held constantly at a temperature others find comfortable. He pressed east into lands where the mountains turned time to stone and resistance into a way of breathing. India came into view. Victories continued, but the men finally refused further war. They wanted to see home and count their share. He listened, at last. He returned to Susa and began the practical work of governing, cutting corrupt satraps from their posts, moving pieces where they fit. Then fever took him in Babylon in 323 BC. He had marched longer than he had lived. A man who could take empires fell to something too small to see. On his deathbed, when asked who should inherit, the phrase attributed to him, "to the strongest," is a knife he left in the map. The realm split and hardened into separate kingdoms. Greece and Macedon here, Asia Minor there, Egypt under Ptolemy, and the vast Iranian and Mesopotamian core under the Seleucids. Greek became the language of educated exchange from the Nile to the Oxus. Temples rose in hybrid styles. Some saw foreign rulers. Many saw little change in the fields. Tax collectors, new seals, old concerns. Further east, Greek kings in Bactria held out long after their cousins nearer the Mediterranean were swallowed by rising powers. Buddhism braided with Hellenic art in those borderlands, and from there the quiet religion walked slow roads toward China. In the Iranian heartland, the Seleucid grip loosened, and another step memory returned wearing a new name, Parthia. Their horse archers became legend for the backward shot delivered while feigning retreat, the Parthian shot that turned pursuit into a fatal impulsive act. They did not centralize like an iron monarchy. Nobles had their own weight, and councils could unseat kings without tearing the state apart every time. Rome learned in sand and dust that its legions could die far from home with their standards lowered. Crassus, whose greed was a proverb, met a punishment that fit the myth. Molten gold forced down a throat that had desired it too much. The Sasanian era rose from a proud memory of earlier Persia, with families from the same regions that had once produced Cyrus insisting on a renewal of Iranian identity. Zoroastrianism now stood closer to the state, not as a persecutor of all difference, but as the cultural frame. The empire that faced Rome's eastern half, Byzantium, was urban and disciplined, with a chancery that understood how to keep records and a vision for the Silk Road that stretched beyond old limits. Envoys and artisans crossed to and from China, and together they guarded caravans against bandits who knew that a few bales of silk could make a fortune. In workshops and vaults, someone built clay jars with metal inside that, when tested today, behave like the simplest form of a battery. No one can swear how they were used, but the puzzle remains like a single dropped bead from a broken necklace. War with Byzantium bled both empires. A plague spread, one of those waves of disease that seem to ride on the very roots trade requires. Turkish raiders struck from the east. In the turmoil after Khosrow II's fall, the throne in Ctesiphon became a chair with 10 claimants in 5 years. When the civil blood quieted, an army from the south arrived with a new faith carried in short surahs and long discipline. The first invasion into Mesopotamia failed. The second did not. By 636, the land west of Iran's core was gone. By 642, the empire toppled. The resistance that followed was real. Uprisings, assassinations, attempts to restore old ways, but reinforcements kept coming from the peninsula. Holy books burned, at least some of them. Taxes on non-Muslims, jizya, marked those who kept other rituals. Communities fled east and south, and a Zoroastrian diaspora took root in India. But conversion across a continent is measured in centuries, not months. The old faith remained in mountain pockets and family memory long after the banners changed. Persia inside the caliphates was never merely a subject. The Umayyads ran an Arab empire that borrowed Persian protocols and drew on Iranian manpower. The Abbasids rose with Persian help and built Baghdad in 762 near the ashes of Babylon, a city that would become a lighthouse of paper and ink. In its workshops, papermaking spread westward from Chinese models. In its libraries, scholars copied not only Arabic verses, but Greek, Persian, and Roman texts, comparing, arguing, preserving. Algebra took shape. Light became an experiment instead of only a metaphor. Physicians wrote handbooks that moved through languages like birds crossing borders. Stories, too, settled there, transformed. Tales traced to India and Persia stitched into a fabric that would be called 1001 Nights. Characters like Sinbad and Aladdin are not simply Arabic. They are the children of a mixed neighborhood. Turkic dynasts, the Seljuks, entered as new guardians and power brokers. The Abbasid Caliph remained a figure to bless and be blessed, but the swords and stipends lay in other hands. Administration stayed Persian in method, and daily life for most people didn't flip into novelty. Then horsemen came, who were like a storm that doesn't move on. The Mongols were not just another steppe replacement, they were annihilation. Baghdad fell in 1258. The libraries burned. Canals were cut or neglected until they died. Cities that had been capitals became graveyards. The Ilkhanate that emerged later tried to repair what its own catastrophe had ruined. Many among them accepted Islam, especially Sufi branches that matched their taste for inward paths and visions. For a moment, it seemed the patient work of irrigation and law might return. But two more blows followed. The pestilence that came in the 14th century, Black Death, ripped through towns and caravans alike, cutting bodies down so fast that memory could not keep up with the names. And a conqueror named Timur built an empire with cruelty so intense that it feels like the edge of a nightmare. He demanded surrender or death, and when refused, he killed all, women, children, the old, stacking skulls to prove a point. He was also a patron of art and architecture, a contradiction that says more about power than any theory can. His creation did not last. The land he scorched needed generations to grow back hair on the scar. Turkoman confederations filled the vacuum, first one flock, then another, until a different kind of unifier appeared. Shah Ismail took an idea as well as a territory. Twelver Shi'ism became the spine of Iran's identity. It absorbed Sufi orders into its body, molded ritual and law, and set the region apart from its Sunni neighbors, not just politically but spiritually. Borders resembling the old Persian silhouette reassembled themselves. The problem to the west, however, had grown into an empire of gunpowder and discipline. The Ottomans. The Safavid state pushed and was pushed back, captured cities and lost them, learned to modernize its army with foreign advisors. Under Shah Abbas I, alliances with Europeans developed out of the logic that the enemy of one's enemy can be an occasional friend. English ships helped Iran reclaim islands and routes in the Persian Gulf. Dutch companies bought silk. Carpets from Isfahan lay on floors from Amsterdam to Venice. Travelers saw wealth and craft, but also fallow field, where irrigation could have changed everything. Prosperity was uneven. The culture glittered, tile and calligraphy, domes like inverted bowls of sky, but intellectual life, in places, began to prefer repetition over risk. Europe, meanwhile, tuned new instruments for inquiry. After Abbas, weaker men held the reins. To the north, Russia, growing like a frost line spreading south, saw opportunity. In 1723, under Peter the Great, Iranian Caucasia was bitten off. Afghan and local revolts opened other wounds. For a short season, the Ottomans and Russians even agreed to divide parts of Iran between them on paper. Then a soldier named Nader pulled the corps back together, marched into India, looted Delhi, and used the treasure to fund campaigns against old enemies. Power turned him paranoid and brutal. His assassination left chaos in its wake. The Qajar dynasty stitched a kind of order in 1796, but they held a world where Europe's machines and banks set new rules. 2 wars with Russia in the early 19th century cost Iran its Caucasian lands permanently. Muslims who didn't wish to live under Christian rule fled south. Inside, courtiers sold favors and futures. Foreign ambassadors bought influence like a commodity. In 1907, 2 distant powers signed a paper, the Anglo-Russian Convention, that split Iran into spheres, as if geography were a chessboard without players. Oil had been discovered in 1908, and the resource that might have built schools and aqueducts instead drew deeper lines of interference and corruption. A constitutional movement tried to adjust the balance, to speak a new language of rights, but the struggle wove into a larger rivalry. British interests to the south and Soviet designs to the north. In 1921, a military figure named Reza rose with British support, and the Pahlavi line began. He pushed a centralized secularizing agenda, national uniforms and new courts, railroads and factories, suspicion of clerics and communists alike. Modernization brought speed and spectacle. It also bred resentment and abuse. During the Second World War, geography again decided fate. Allied armies entered to secure supply routes to the Soviet Union and to prevent a German turn. The land served as a corridor for machines and grain under Lend-Lease, and political sovereignty bent to the needs of larger wars. Afterward, a prime minister named Mossadegh tried to nationalize oil and work towards a constitutional monarchy that wasn't theater. He was removed in 1953 in a coup engineered with outside help. The Shah returned with stronger powers. For 2 decades, foreign companies shared or controlled the oil lifeline. In 1973, amid an oil shock that changed the world's economics, the state reasserted control and used the windfall to buy jets and roads and the look of wealth. The look could not bury the anger. In 1979, a revolution swept the old order away and built an Islamic republic. Those who had marched under communist banners were soon cut out of the new structure. The United States became the symbol of everything wrong, and the hostage crisis turned a national reset into a global spectacle. In the next year, Iraq invaded, and a long, grinding war began. It felt ancient in shape, plains against highland routes, but modern in horror. Gas drifted across trenches, cities endured missiles that fell without warning. The conflict ended without a clear victor, but with a generation marked by funerals and empty chairs. Sanctions came later, pressures tied to nuclear ambitions and to regional influence. Yet even isolated by some and condemned by others, the country did not step outside history. It reached toward the east, made common cause with powers like China and Russia, where interests aligned, entered frameworks and organizations that promised trade and voice outside Western approval. At the same time, it cultivated relationships in the old Persian sphere, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and further into Yemen, projecting presence through allies and proxy methods. The empire of the past is not literally restored. The world no longer allows such borders. But the habit of being a center did not vanish. It adapted. And beneath these political surfaces, the older story continues to hum. The Khanats still exist, some flowing, some collapsed. They testify to a kind of engineering that knew the value of patience. The domes of Isfahan still catch late sun. In villages and cities, women who run shops and offices are the descendants, spiritually if not by name, of those figures carved on old Elamite seals, standing as equals in art. In archives, scribes from 25 centuries ago still argue with us by implication about how to manage a state. Multiple capitals, strong inspectors, a rider who finds a bed and a fresh horse guaranteed by law. In small rooms where families unwind, backgammon pieces still click and slide with a sound that has not dated. Fire, when used in worship by the few who keep the old rites, is the same element that warmed the prayers of priests before Alexander was born. What makes Persia, what makes Iran so hard to erase is not merely armies or decrees. It is the combination of geography and habit, mountains that protect without fully isolating, plateaus that command roots, a people who learned early to mix and adopt without losing the thread of themselves. Conquerors arrived and forced languages onto coins, but the market still haggled in familiar cadences. Dynasties fell, but the scribes who trained the new satraps had been trained by the old ones. Even when religion shifted under pressure, it reshaped the religion that took its place. Islam in Iran, especially its Shia heart, now carries textures that came from centuries of Iranian thought and Sufi practice. Influence went both ways. It still does. This is not to romanticize. The record includes cruelty, oppression, mistakes that cost millions. There are burned cities and bones under fields. There are leaders who drank too much, rulers who confused the palace for the nation, scholars who chose safety over inquiry, politicians who sold futures to foreigners for brief control today. But an honest ledger shows both columns. Technical brilliance beside complacency, tolerance beside revenge, roads beside fires. In the present, the country stands under pressure and yet remains a hinge for regions surrounding it. It negotiates, threatens, reassures, isolates and engages by turns. It joins groups like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to signal belonging to a world not centered in the Atlantic. It faces sanctions and answers with workarounds. It speaks to movements and militias in places where Persian kings once taxed farmers, but with tools the ancients would not recognize. The style has changed. The instinct to be a player has not. If someone asks why this story endures, point them to the mountains first, then to Susa's long timeline, then to a courier who never had to sleep outside, then to a king who was praised by people he conquered. Point them to qanats laid under rock by men who understood that water and time have similar tempers. Point them to a library that once tried to hold all human thought, and to a city that keeps its blue mosques polished, even when politics turns gray. Point them to a jar of old wine, proof that people in this land learned early not only to grow, but to celebrate. The timeline is a braid, not a line. Elam into Medes, into Achaemenids, the long trunk. Alexander as a lightning strike. Seleucids, Parthians, Sasanians, branches and grafts. Arabs arriving with a book that would change the last two-thirds of the narrative. Persians changing the way that book would be read from Istanbul to Delhi. Turks riding in. Mongols burning out. Timur terrifying everyone into silence. Safavids turning identity into law. Qajars hesitating as engines to the north began to churn. Pahlavis building highways and anger. Revolution swallowing its former allies. A war of trenches and missiles. A modern state negotiating old corridors with new passwords. It is tempting to end with a declaration, something confident and final. But Persia never ends. It reappears, wearing the clothes of the century that tries to contain it. The old names keep their power because they name things that still exist. A habit of administration that values inspection. A love of craft that can cover a room with woven sky. A regard for learning that outlives the libraries that are burned. A refusal to leave the stage even when the script is written elsewhere. If empires are judged by how they teach the world to think and build, This one has already passed its exam many times over. If they are judged by whether they survive every invasion untouched, then none of them ever truly pass. The truth is in the endurance, neither immortal nor fragile, but stubborn, adaptable, old, and awake. And so the camera pulls back over the Zagros again, where the first villagers bent wild grains to their will. The frame widens to river plains, where cities wrote their names in clay. It floats east along caravan trails where tin and tails changed hands. It rests above Susa, and then Persepolis, and then the great dome of a mosque whose builders etched geometry into tile until it looked like music. Farther still, it pauses over deserts where lines of holes mark the course of an underground stream, and then over a city whose streets once served not only the people who lived there, but the world beyond. The music fades, but the hum remains, as if the land was still speaking, patient as stone, saying, "They came, they learned, they fought, they built, they burned, they rebuilt, and I remained." The land breathes memory like dust. The farther you look into Iran's history, the more you begin to feel that nothing here truly disappears. Stones are repurposed, temples turned into mosques, and languages pressed one over another like palimpsests. Yet under each change, something original and unmistakably Persian remains: a sense of endurance, of re-emergence after defeat, like fire rekindled from embers buried under sand. Long before maps drew borders, Persia was already a concept, not just geography, but temperament. The geography made the people, and the people shaped how power functioned. Mountains fenced the west, deserts shielded the east, and the plateaus gave natural defense against invaders who relied on speed and surprise. The climate was cruel, but the cruelty sharpened resourcefulness. That's why conquerors often found that seizing Persia was easier than holding it. Armies could pass through, but the land itself absorbed them, changed them. Even Alexander's men, when they settled, found themselves wearing Persian garments, marrying local women, and praying under foreign stars. Empires may burn cities, but they rarely burn culture. When the Greeks divided Alexander's realm, the Seleucid Empire tried to anchor Hellenism in Asia, but the mountains were never kind to outsiders. Greek satraps learned local languages, local customs, and slowly became something else, a hybrid people. That's why Greek art from Iran doesn't look entirely Greek. It carries the imprint of local artisans, curved in the lines of faces, in the symmetry of wings carved into stone. This merging Greek ideals with Iranian craftsmanship created a visual vocabulary that outlasted both conqueror and conquered. Even Buddhist statues from Central Asia carry that mixed blood, the robe of Apollo draped over an Eastern face. The Parthians, who came next, ruled like a wind that could not be caged. They were horsemen, archers, heirs of the steppe, but their rule was not chaos. They understood diplomacy, adopted Persian administration, and used Greek coinage. Their strength came from the balance between freedom and structure. They knew that to survive long, they couldn't crush every local ruler. They had to weave them into a web of loyalty. The Romans to the west never understood that. They believed empires were bricks and iron. Persia knew empires were threads and breath. At Carrhae in 53 BC, when the Roman general Crassus led his legions east seeking glory, he met the Parthian cavalry, a storm of arrows from men who rode backward while firing, the infamous Parthian shot. The Roman square shattered under a sky of feathered death. Crassus was captured and killed, legend says, by molten gold poured into his mouth, a brutal metaphor for his greed. That single story, whether literal or not, etched a truth into the imagination of both worlds. Rome could be feared, but Persia could humiliate. The two giants would clash again and again, neither ever truly destroying the other, locked in a rivalry that shaped the ancient world's east-west divide. Centuries later, a new dynasty emerged, the Sasanians. They called themselves the restorers of the old Persian glory, heirs to Cyrus and Darius, not to Greeks or nomads. Their banners bore fire and the sacred Faravahar, the winged symbol of divine guidance. The Sasanians made Zoroastrianism not just faith, but state. Fire temples dotted the empire. Priests guarded the flames, which symbolized purity, truth, and order, the three pillars of creation. Unlike Rome, which often fractured along lines of religion, Persia made belief an instrument of unity. And yet, even this empire of conviction showed tolerance. Jews, Christians, and even Buddhists found protection, paying taxes but keeping their temples. The empire's identity was strong enough not to fear difference. Trade connected Sasanian Iran to the Silk Road, the great artery of the ancient world. Caravans moved silk, spices, and gems from China through Persian lands to the Mediterranean. Persian merchants controlled the Middle Passage, the most profitable section. Along the roads came not just goods, but ideas. Art from India, stories from China, philosophies from Greece, and mathematics from Babylon. Persia stood at the crossroad of all knowledge, and because of that, it became both bridge and filter, choosing what to absorb, what to refine, what to transmit onward. That's how the Persian aesthetic became universal, without ever becoming diluted. Even in warfare, the Sasanians preferred precision over chaos. They built organized armies with armored cavalry cataphracts, wrapped in steel like walking fortresses. Against Rome, they fought on near equal terms for centuries. They captured emperors, sacked Antioch, and at times reached as far as the eastern Mediterranean. Rome, later Byzantium, could never ignore them. In Constantinople, emperors measured their power not against barbarians from the north, but against the fire worshippers from the east. Yet, as history loves to repeat, every strength grows into vulnerability. Long wars with Byzantium drained both sides. When the plague of Shiroye, the plague of Sharvaras hit in the 7th century, the empire faltered. The king was assassinated, civil war erupted, and just as exhaustion set in, the desert winds carried a new force Arab tribes united under a single banner, the banner of Islam. When they invaded, they came not just as conquerors, but as missionaries with a creed of equality that appealed to the oppressed. Persian nobles resisted fiercely, but fatigue and internal division crippled them. The Battle of Qadisiyah broke Sasanian defenses. The empire collapsed like a tree hollowed from within. Fire temples went dark, priests were killed or exiled. The Zoroastrian texts, the Avesta, were burned in part, preserved only in fragments whispered across generations. The survivors fled east, forming what would later be known as the Parsi community of India. But conquest, as always in Persia, did not mean erasure. Islam may have changed the face of the empire, but the heart beneath the new robe still beat Persian. Arab rulers adopted Persian administration, Persian art, Persian court etiquette. Even their word for vizier, a minister, came from Persian roots. Baghdad, built by the Abbasids, was designed by Persian engineers, staffed by Persian scribes. If you looked closely, the so-called Arab Empire had Persian handwriting all over it. Under the Abbasids, Baghdad became a jewel. Paper mills churned out knowledge. Scholars translated Aristotle into Arabic with Persian commentaries. Mathematics flourished, algebra, algorithms, numbers that replaced the cumbersome Roman system, all shaped in part by Persian minds. Physicians like Al-Razi and Avicenna wrote treatises that would guide Europe centuries later. These men didn't simply copy Greek wisdom. They expanded it, argued with it, improved it. In their eyes, science was worship, discovery, a form of prayer. Even stories became bridges between worlds. The tales of 1001 Nights, often thought of as purely Arab, carried Persian roots deep beneath the surface. Many of its early stories were translations of Persian epics or Indian fables retold in the marketplaces of Baghdad. The magic carpets, jinns, and clever tricksters that filled those pages owe as much to Persian imagination as to any other culture. but light attracts shadow. In the 13th century, the Mongols came not to trade, but to destroy. They swept through Central Asia like locusts, leaving only smoke and silence. When they reached Baghdad in 1258, they slaughtered nearly every living thing within the walls. The Tigris turned black with the ink of drowned manuscripts. It was not just a city they burned, but a civilization's memory. Persia, too, suffered. Khanats were destroyed, farms vanished, and towns that had stood since the days of Cyrus were reduced to ash. And yet somehow the land recovered again. Under the Ilkhanate, the Mongols who settled gradually converted to Islam. They rebuilt cities, restored canals, and even sponsored art that fused Mongol vigor with Persian refinement. Miniature paintings flourished delicate, colorful worlds where mountains rolled like waves and faces carried both Chinese and Persian grace. Civilization, wounded but alive, began to sing again. Then came another conqueror, Timur, or Tamerlane, part Turkic, part Mongol, all ambition. He promised order and delivered terror. Entire populations vanished in his wake. His soldiers piled skulls in pyramids high enough to cast shadows over cities that no longer existed. Yet, in his capital of Samarkand, poets, mathematicians, and architects thrived under his patronage. Such contradictions define the story of power in this region. Beauty built atop bones. The chaos that followed Timur's death fractured Persia once again. Turkoman tribes like the Black Sheep and White Sheep confederations fought for control until the rise of Shah Ismail in the early 1500s. With him began the Safavid dynasty, a line that would fuse Persian heritage with a new religious identity. Under the Safavids, Shia Islam became the state religion, giving Iran a distinct character that still shapes its politics today. It was not only a spiritual shift, but a cultural declaration. Iran would no longer mirror its Sunni neighbors. It would walk its own path. Shah Ismail's reign unified the land, but it was Shah Abbas the Great who turned it into an empire that the world noticed. He moved the capital to Isfahan, transforming it into a masterpiece of geometry and light. The city's grand square, Naksh-e-Jahan, became a symbol of Persian glory, surrounded by mosques with domes that shimmered like turquoise waves frozen in air. Abbas welcomed artists, merchants, and diplomats from across the world. The British traded gunpowder and ships. The Dutch East India Company opened warehouses. Silk flowed out by the ton. The Safavid army modernized, mixing European technology with Iranian strategy. For a while, it looked like Persia might reclaim its ancient place as the bridge between East and West. But empires like stars burn brightest before they fade. After Abbas, weaker rulers inherited the throne. Corruption spread and rural neglect deepened. Russia, rising from the north under Peter the Great, eyed the Caucasus. The Ottomans pressed from the west. The empire fractured. By the 18th century, Afghanistan rebelled. Iraq was lost, and European powers began carving up influence. Persia, once a power that could rival Rome, now found itself surrounded by modern empires with iron ships and industrial guns. Then came Nader Shah, a soldier who rose from obscurity, seized power, and, for a brief moment, restored Persia's pride. His invasion of India in 1739 was brutal and legendary. He sacked Delhi, carrying back so much wealth that taxes in Persia were abolished for 3 years. Among his spoils was the peacock throne, symbol of Indian royalty, now reimagined as Persian. Yet his cruelty grew with his power. Paranoia turned his court into a trap of fear. When he was assassinated, his empire crumbled with him. The Qajar dynasty followed in the late 18th century, ruling from Tehran with elegance but little control. The 19th century brought new empires, Britain and Russia, who fought their great game across Central Asia, using Persia as their chessboard. Treaties in 1813 and 1828 forced Iran to surrender the Caucasus to Russia. The humiliation scarred the national psyche. Intellectuals began to whisper about reform, about freedom, about a constitution. The constitutional revolution of 1906 to 1911 brought the first parliament to Persia, but also new chaos. The dream of democracy collided with the reality of foreign manipulation. Oil changed everything. In 1908, the first wells were drilled in Khuzestan. What was once the secret of geology became the obsession of empires. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, controlled production, while Iranians saw little of the wealth beneath their soil. In 1921, Reza Khan, a military officer with ambition as fierce as any emperor's, staged a coup. He crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, promising modernization and independence. Railroads spread, universities opened, and dress codes changed. But his authoritarianism bred resentment. Religion was suppressed, dissent silenced, and corruption normalized under the slogan of progress. World War II exposed the fragility of his rule. Accused of leaning toward Germany, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate by Allied invasion. His son, Mohammad Reza, took the throne under Allied watch. The war turned Iran into a corridor for American supplies to the Soviet Union, the Persian corridor, a route that helped win battles far away, but left scars at home. When the war ended, Iran's young Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decided that oil must belong to the people. He nationalized it, an act that made him a hero to some and an enemy to many. In 1953, British and American intelligence orchestrated a coup. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah returned, stronger but beholden. The following decades were paradoxical rapid modernization alongside growing alienation. Skyscrapers rose in Tehran, while villages remained in poverty. Western movies filled cinemas while clerics warned of spiritual decay. By the 1970s, oil prices soared, filling the treasury with billions, but the gap between rich and poor widened. The monarchy celebrated ancient Persian kings with lavish festivals in Persepolis, but ordinary Iranians saw only extravagance. Beneath the glitter, unrest grew. Then, in 1979, the pressure broke. The Islamic Revolution toppled the Shah, ending 2,500 years of monarchy. Crowds filled the streets shouting for justice, for purity, for a return to values they felt the modern world had abandoned. A new leader emerged, Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Islamic Republic was born. The world watched in shock as one of its oldest allies turned into one of its fiercest critics. The U.S. Embassy was stormed, diplomats taken hostage, and relations severed for decades. What began as rebellion against corruption transformed into a new order built on faith and defiance. A year later, Saddam Hussein invaded, hoping to exploit chaos. What followed was 8 years of horror trench warfare, gas attacks, cities bombed into dust. The Iran-Iraq war killed more than 1 million. It ended without a victor, only exhaustion. But in its ashes, Iran discovered something enduring: self-reliance. Isolated and sanctioned, it learned to produce its own weapons, its own medicine, its own fuel. The revolution, tempered by war, became not just a moment, but a mindset. In the decades since, Iran has remained a contradiction, modern yet traditional, isolated yet deeply connected through unseen networks. Its nuclear ambitions have brought sanctions. Its alliances have reshaped the Middle East. It supports movements in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, influence that stretches across the map like ghostly fingerprints of an empire reborn in another form. The West sees aggression. Iran sees survival, the old Persian instinct to project power before power arrives at its borders. Today, the story continues with new players but old rhythms. China and Russia court Tehran. Western nations negotiate and threaten. The Persian Gulf remains a chessboard where ships shadow one another under the sun. Yet, through all of this, Iran still finds ways to turn pressure into creativity. Its filmmakers win awards abroad. Its poets still write verses that blend mysticism with rebellion. Its cities hum with the detention of youth caught between tradition and technology. Beneath the politics lies something older and more permanent, a sense that this land has seen everything before and will see everything again. Because that's what Persia, what Iran has always been, a survivor's chronicle. The mountains that once hid Elamite villages still rise over highways now carved through their slopes. The qanats still carry water dug by hands that never knew electricity. Women still weave carpets whose patterns echo those seen in Persepolis bas-reliefs. Children still play backgammon under the same stars that shone over Cyrus and Darius. The names have changed, but the essence remains. History here doesn't travel in a straight line. It loops, echoes, folds over itself. The same themes appear: empire and invasion, reform and repression, pride and resilience. The soil remembers every footstep. The stones of Persepolis, though broken, still stand upright against wind and time, as if waiting for the next chapter to begin. And if you stand in the desert at night, where the sky is so clear it looks infinite, you can almost hear the whisper of that long memory, the whisper of a people who have fallen 100 times and risen 100 more. The whisper of Persia,